That pile of rotting weeds is a blight on this community, and you have 72 hours to remove it, or the fines will start at $500 a day, Mr. Garrison. We will place a lien on this pathetic excuse for a farm so fast your head will spin. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, stood on my side of the property line, her floral print muumuu straining against the humid July air, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy shield. Her face was a mask of furious certainty, a blotchy, sunburnt canvas of pure entitlement. The pile of rotting weeds she was pointing a trembling, sausage-like finger at was, in fact, 3 dozen professionally stacked, tightly bound round bales of Tifton 85 hay, my primary feed supply for the winter, and more importantly, the very thing the county fire code required as a fire break between my agricultural land and the brand new tinderbox houses of her pristine subdivision. I could see the tops of their identical beige roofs just over the crest of the hill. A neat row of monopoly houses dropped into a world they didn't understand. She took a deep theatrical breath, puffing out her chest. This is a fire hazard, an eyesore, and a violation of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B, Maintenance of undeveloped or adjacent lots. We have a standard to uphold. People paid millions for these homes, not for a view of your hobo ranch. This is the moment my quiet retirement ended and the war began. If you've ever had your own nightmare with a power-tripping HOA board, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. I want to hear your stories because, believe me, you are not alone. Now let me take you back to how this all started. It wasn't just about the hay. It was never just about the hay. It was about a promise I made to my grandfather 20 years ago in a dusty corner of Afghanistan. A promise sealed over a crackling satellite phone call while the sound of distant rotors beat against the thin canvas of my tent. He was dying, and the one thing he asked of me was to never let them pave over his legacy, to keep the 100 acres of rolling North Georgia land he'd carved out of the wilderness as a place of peace and purpose. He'd left it to me, his only grandson, a master sergeant in the Air Force with a penchant for fixing broken things, from C-130 engines to, as it turned out, broken down horses. After 22 years of service, I came home, not to a parade, but to the quiet dignity of this land. I started a small, self-funded horse rescue, taking in the animals that had been forgotten, the ones with splintered spirits and weary bones. The rhythm of the work, the pre-dawn feedings, the mending of fences, the smell of fresh-cut hay, was a balm to a soul worn smooth by years of deployments and the disciplined chaos of military life. For 5 years, it was paradise. My nearest neighbor was a mile down the dirt road, and the only rules I followed were the ones dictated by the seasons and the needs of my animals. Then came the bulldozers. On the adjacent 200-acre tract, a developer from Atlanta bought the land and Whispering Pines Estates was born. They clear-cut ancient oaks, leveled the gentle hills, and packed in luxury homes so close together you could pass a cup of sugar from window to window. They built right up to my fence line, a meticulously surveyed and long-established border that had separated my family's land from the wild for nearly a century. And with the houses came the HOA, and with the HOA came Karen. I'd seen her before, driving her golf cart slowly along the fence, her face pinched in disapproval as she surveyed my world. The rust-colored barn, the grazing horses, the sturdy but unpainted fences that had stood for 50 years. She saw decay where I saw history. She saw mess where I saw life. And now she saw a violation where the law itself had mandated a protection. She mistook my calm demeanor for weakness, my quiet life for passivity. That was the first of many mistakes she would make. The fine she handed me wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. The document itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, printed on thick, creamy letterhead, bearing the ostentatious Whispering Pines Estates logo, 2 intertwined pine trees that looked more like misshapen green daggers. The language was deliberately vague and menacing, citing clauses and subsections without providing the actual text, a classic tactic designed to overwhelm and confuse. It spoke of ongoing non-compliance, aesthetic degradation, and potential legal remedies, including foreclosure. The sheer audacity of threatening to foreclose on a property that wasn't even part of her jurisdiction, a property that had been in my family since before the state had even paved the main highway, was breathtaking. I folded the paper neatly, my movements slow and deliberate, a habit learned from years of handling sensitive equipment in volatile situations. Panic is a luxury you can't afford when you're 30,000 feet in the air with an engine on fire, and it's just as useless when you're facing a ground-level tyrant in a muumuu. "Karen," I said, my voice even and low, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention." Her eyes narrowed, surprised by my lack of immediate outrage. She was expecting a shouting match, a scene she could later recount to her board as proof of my uncooperative and aggressive nature. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. "However," I continued, holding the fine between my thumb and forefinger, "you seem to be operating under a significant misunderstanding of both county fire regulations and property law." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before being immediately replaced by a fresh wave of indignation. "There is no misunderstanding. I am the president of the board. I have spoken with our attorney. That pile," she jabbed her finger toward the hay again, "is a nuisance and it has to go." I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll be responding to your board in a formal capacity. You have a good day now." I turned and walked back toward my barn, not giving her another look, feeling her furious gaze burning into my back. Inside, the familiar smell of leather and horse feed settled my nerves. I laid the violation notice on my workbench, right next to a bridle I was mending. This was her chosen battlefield: paperwork, rules, and intimidation. Fine. I had spent over 2 decades in an organization that practically invented bureaucracy. She wanted a paper war? I would give her a library. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, it was to the County Planning and Zoning Office. My second was to the office of the County Fire Marshal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't complain about the HOA. I simply and calmly asked for documentation. "Good morning," I said to the clerk at the fire marshal's office. "I'm calling to request a copy of the fire code requirements for new residential developments built adjacent to designated agricultural lands, specifically regarding firebreak and buffer zone mandates." There was a pause, some typing, and then a friendly voice on the other end. "Ah, yes, the Wildland Urban Interface Code. Are you referring to the new Whispering Pines development by any chance?" The fact that he knew the name immediately was my first sign that this was a well-trodden path. "That's the one, I confirmed. "We've had a few calls on that," he said with a sigh. The developer was required to submit a comprehensive fire mitigation plan. Part of that plan, in a condition of their permit, was maintaining a 50-foot defensible space between their structures and your property line. Since your property is active agricultural, a stacked vegetative buffer, like hay bales, is actually one of the recommended and approved methods for fulfilling that requirement on your side of the line. It serves to slow a ground fire. I felt a cold, clean wave of vindication wash over me. Would it be possible to get a copy of that permit condition and the relevant code section in writing? I asked. And would it be possible for an inspector to come out and officially document that my current hay storage complies with that mandate? The man on the phone, a deputy marshal named Miller, chuckled. "Son, I'll do you one better. I'll write you a formal letter myself and have it notarized. We're tired of these HOA commandos thinking their little neighborhood rules trump public safety laws. I can have it ready for you by tomorrow afternoon." This was the first brick in my wall of evidence, a foundation of cold, hard, undeniable fact. Karen had fired the first shot, but she had aimed it directly at her own foot. With Deputy Marshal Miller's promise of official documentation secured, my next step was to build my own case file with the same meticulous precision I used to use for aircraft maintenance logs. Every bolt, every wire, every inspection had to be accounted for, creating an unbroken chain of evidence that could withstand any scrutiny. This was no different. I drove into town and bought a heavy-duty 3-ring binder, a pack of divider tabs, and sheet protectors. Back at my workbench, I labeled the tabs: HOA correspondence, county ordinances, fire marshal communications, property surveys and deeds, photographic evidence, and timeline. The first document I slid into a protector was Karen's violation notice, a trophy of her arrogance. I then spent the next several hours in my small office, digging through the old metal file cabinet that had belonged to my grandfather. Inside, smelling of aged paper and cedar, was the history of my land. I found the original deed from 1948, the property survey from the last assessment in 1997, and the county zoning classification certificate designating my 100 acres as agricultural residential. Each document was a golden ticket, another piece of armor. I made high-quality copies of everything. The next morning, I took my digital camera and walked the entire length of the fence line I shared with Whispering Pines. I took wide shots showing the hay bales, my fence, the 50-foot grassy buffer on their side, and then their houses looming just beyond. I took close-ups of the survey markers embedded in the ground, iron pins that had marked that boundary for decades. I took photos from the road, showing the clear distinction between my working farm and their manicured enclave. Every photo was time-stamped. I was building a narrative, a visual story that would leave no room for misinterpretation. By noon the next day, I was at the county government complex, a drab brick building that held the keys to my defense. I picked up the notarized letter from Deputy Marshal Miller. It was even better than I had hoped. It not only confirmed that my hay bales were a valid and compliant firebreak, but also explicitly stated that any attempt to force the removal of this approved firebreak buffer could be interpreted as a willful obstruction of a public safety mandate and may subject the responsible parties to review by this office. It was a polite but firm bureaucratic threat, and it was aimed directly at Karen's clipboard. While I was there, I stopped by the zoning office and got a certified copy of the local Right to Farm Ordinance, a state law that protects established agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits filed by new residential neighbors who move in next door and then complain about the normal sights, sounds, and smells of farming. It was a law written for this exact situation. My binder was getting heavy. It felt good. Armed with a fortress of facts, I sat down to compose my response. I didn't write an angry email or make a furious phone call. I drafted a formal business letter addressed to the Whispering Pines Estates Board of Directors. Care of Karen. The tone was professional, dispassionate, and utterly unassailable. I began by acknowledging receipt of their notice of violation. Then, point by point, I dismantled their claims. Regarding your assertion that my hay storage constitutes a fire hazard, I wrote, please find enclosed Exhibit A, a notarized letter from the county fire marshal's office, which states that said hay bales are, in fact, a legally compliant and recommended firebreak, essential for the protection of your own residents in the wildland-urban interface. Regarding the claim that my property is in violation of your covenants, I continued, please find enclosed Exhibit B, a certified copy of my property deed and the official county zoning map, which clearly show that my parcel is not and has never been subject to the authority or regulations of the Whispering Pines Estates HOA. Furthermore, please see Exhibit C, a copy of the state's Right to Farm Act, which provides statutory protection for my ongoing agricultural activities. I concluded the letter by politely requesting that they immediately rescind the violation notice and all associated fines, and that they update their records to reflect the legal and jurisdictional boundaries. I trust this documentation will resolve the matter, I finished, a sentence that was equal parts sincerity and veiled challenge. I made 3 copies of the entire package, one for my binder, one for my own records, and one to send. I drove to the post office and sent the package via certified mail with return receipt requested. The little green card, when it came back with a signature, would be irrefutable proof that they had received and been made aware of the facts. The ball was now in her court. I had responded not with emotion, but with overwhelming, documented bureaucratic force. I had followed the rules, the real ones. I fully expected a grudging letter of apology, or more likely just silence as the issue was quietly dropped. I had underestimated the boundless depths of her ego. A week later, the mail carrier's truck rumbled down my long gravel driveway and deposited another crisp, cream-colored envelope in my mailbox. The return address was Whispering Pines Estates. My certified mail receipt card had come back 2 days prior, bearing a spiky, illegible signature I assumed was Karen's. She had received my package. This new letter was her answer. I opened it right there at the end of the drive, leaning against the warm metal of my truck. The letter was short, sharp, and dripping with contempt. It was from Karen, of course, signed with her title President, Board of Directors, underlined twice. Mr. Garrison, it began, we are in receipt of your recent correspondence and its various unverified attachments. The board has reviewed your claims and finds them to be without merit and irrelevant to the standards of our community. The HOA's legal counsel has advised us that your self-produced evidence does not supersede our established covenants. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it almost made me laugh. She was calling a notarized letter from the fire marshal and certified county documents unverified attachments. She was doubling down, choosing to believe her own reality over the legal and physical one. The letter went on to inform me that because I had failed to comply with the original removal order, the initial fine of $500 had now been doubled to $1,000, and daily fines of $100 would now accrue until the nuisance was abated. The final paragraph was a masterstroke of passive-aggressive threats. We strongly advise you to reconsider your position. The aesthetic and financial integrity of our neighborhood is our paramount concern, and we will take any and all legal steps necessary to protect it, up to and including placing a lien on your property and pursuing foreclosure to satisfy outstanding debts. The mention of their lawyer was a classic bluff, meant to scare me into submission. But I knew something about institutional power dynamics. A lawyer for a small HOA like this was likely just a name on retainer, someone they paid a small monthly fee to for basic advice, not someone they had on standby for a full-blown, expensive legal battle over a non-existent jurisdiction, especially one they were so clearly in the wrong on. This wasn't a legal strategy. This was pure Karen. This escalation changed the game. My initial, logical, by-the-book approach had failed because I was dealing with an illogical actor. Karen wasn't interested in facts or laws. She was interested in power. She couldn't stand that my 100 acres of rustic freedom existed as a daily rebuke to her tiny kingdom of beige conformity. This was personal for her, and now she was making it personal for me. It was time to expand my operational theater. I realized I couldn't fight this alone, armed only with my binder. I needed allies. I started with my immediate neighbors, the ones who, like me, lived on the periphery of Whispering Pines. I drove down the road to see Bill, a retired mechanic who had lived on his 20 acres for 40 years. I found him in his massive workshop, tinkering with a vintage tractor. I laid out the letters from Karen on a workbench. He read them, his brow furrowed, and then he let out a low whistle. That woman is wound tighter than a banjo string, he said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. She sent me a letter last month, said my rooster was a noise pollutant. A rooster? I've had chickens here since before she was born. He told me about 2 other longtime residents who had received similar harassing notices, one for a visually offensive woodpile, another for the unapproved color of their satellite dish. Karen was testing the fences, seeing how far she could push her authority beyond its legal bounds. We weren't just neighbors, we were a pattern. My next move was more delicate. I needed intelligence from behind enemy lines. I needed to know what was happening inside the HOA itself. Was the entire board as unhinged as Karen, or was she a solo operator? I remembered seeing a younger man, probably in his late 30s, jogging along the path on the HOA side of the fence. He'd sometimes give me a friendly wave, a stark contrast to the suspicious glares I got from most residents. One Saturday morning, I saw him out again. I was mending a section of fence near the property line, and I deliberately ran out of staples. I walked over toward the fence, making it look like I was just taking a break. He slowed to a walk as he approached. "Morning," he said, pulling out his earbuds. "Morning," I replied. "Beautiful day for a run." We made small talk for a minute about the weather, and then I took a calculated risk. "Listen, this might be a little forward," I said, keeping my voice low and conversational. "But you live in Whispering Pines, right?" "I'm John Garrison. I own this place." He nodded. "Yeah, I'm Mark. Nice to meet you properly. Mark, I've been getting some aggressive letters from your HOA president about my hay." I watched his face carefully, a flicker of recognition, and then a weary sigh. "Let me guess, Karen?" he said, rolling his eyes. You have no idea. She runs that board like her own personal fiefdom. Most of us just try to stay off her radar. This was the opening I needed. She's threatening to put a lien on my property, I said. A property that isn't even in your HOA. Mark stopped, his friendly demeanor replaced by a look of serious concern. She's what? That's a massive overreach. She can't do that. Is the rest of the board aware of this? I sent them a package of documents from the county and the fire marshal proving my case. Her response was to double the fine and dismiss the evidence. Mark shook his head in disbelief. I'm a lawyer, John, not property law. I'm a corporate guy. But I know enough to know that what she's doing is legally indefensible and exposes the HOA to a massive liability. She's acting completely rogue. He gave me his phone number. Keep me in the loop, he said. I think there are a few other homeowners who are getting tired of her antics. Maybe it's time someone started asking for a look at the books. I walked back to my barn with Mark's number in my pocket. I now had a man on the inside. The board wasn't a monolith. It was a dictatorship with a growing resistance. Karen thought she was isolating me. In reality, she was uniting her opposition. The war of paper began in earnest. Following the second threatening letter, Karen opened up a multi-front assault, and each new salvo arrived in one of her signature cream-colored envelopes, a passive-aggressive declaration of her continued obsession. It became clear that her initial complaint about the hay was merely a pretext, a foot in the door to harass me on every conceivable front. The fines started piling up, each one more absurd than the last. A notice arrived for an unapproved commercial vehicle, citing my F250 pickup truck and the stock trailer I used to transport horses to the vet or pick up rescues. The fact that they were parked 100 yards from the property line on my own land was, in her mind, irrelevant. They were visible from the second-story window of one of the McMansions, and that was enough to constitute an aesthetic violation. Another fine appeared for excessive dust, claiming that my truck driving up and down my own half-mile-long gravel driveway was kicking up particulates that settled on the pristine paint jobs of their luxury SUVs. I received a violation for the dilapidated condition of my barn. The barn was built by my grandfather in 1955. It was made of solid oak and cypress, and it had weathered dozens of hurricanes and ice storms. The paint was faded, yes, but the structure was as sound as the day it was built. To Karen, its history was just decay. The most ludicrous fine, the one that made me laugh out loud, was for unregulated livestock. She was fining me for having horses on my agriculturally zoned land. Each notice was a work of art in its own right, a testament to a mind unburdened by logic or legal restraint. With each new fine, I followed a strict protocol, advised by my old Air Force buddy Dave, who had since become a sharp real estate lawyer in Atlanta, and my new inside man, Mark. Don't ignore a single one, John, Dave had warned me over the phone. Treat every single one as a serious legal threat and respond with overwhelming, documented proof. We're not just building a defense. We're building a prosecution. We're giving her all the rope she needs. So for every fine, I drafted a new, formal letter. For the commercial vehicle fine, I included a copy of my vehicle registration, showing it was a personal, non-commercial truck, and cited the county ordinance that explicitly permitted the parking of farm equipment on agricultural land. I attached photos showing the extreme distance from my trailer to their property line. For the excessive dust fine, I included a printout of the daily weather report showing a 15-mile-per-hour wind blowing from the north, directly away from their development, and politely noted that gravel driveways were standard for rural properties. For the dilapidated barn fine, I hired a certified structural engineer to inspect the barn. It cost me $400. But the report he produced was glorious. It declared the barn structurally superior to most modern residential constructions and estimated its remaining lifespan at a minimum of 100 years. I gleefully attached a copy of that report to my response letter. To the unregulated livestock fine, I simply attached another copy of my property's agricultural zoning certificate and a printout of the definition of agriculture from the county's own glossary. Every response was sent via certified mail, return receipt requested. My binder grew thicker, heavier. The HOA correspondence section was now 3 inches thick, a chronological catalog of Karen's escalating madness and my calm, methodical rebuttals. The postage costs were adding up, but I considered it an investment. Each certified mail receipt was another nail. Meanwhile, Mark was doing his own reconnaissance inside Whispering Pines. He spoke quietly with other homeowners, gauging the temperature. He found that while many were apathetic, content to pay their dues and be left alone, a growing number were chafing under Karen's rule. There was the family who had been fined because their children's basketball hoop was visible from the street for 2 hours after dusk. There was the retired couple who were ordered to dig up a rose garden their grandchildren had planted because the specific variety of rose wasn't on the HOA's approved flora list. These weren't just rules. They were instruments of control wielded by Karen to enforce her personal aesthetic on everyone around her. Mark discovered that Karen was making these decisions unilaterally. The other 4 members of the board were largely passive. 2 were her close friends who rubber-stamped whatever she wanted, and the other 2 were tired of fighting her and had essentially abdicated their responsibilities. She wasn't holding proper board meetings or recording minutes for these enforcement actions, a clear violation of the HOA's own bylaws and state law. The legal counsel she kept referencing? Mark found out it was her husband's cousin, who practiced family law 2 counties over. He wasn't on retainer. She was just calling him for off-the-cuff advice, then presenting it to the community as the HOA's official legal position. The paper war was a calculated strategy of attrition. Karen assumed that a regular guy like me would eventually get tired, get scared by the mounting fines, which by her count were now in the tens of thousands of dollars, and give in. She assumed I'd remove the hay, paint the barn, and hide my truck just to make her go away. She fundamentally misunderstood the mindset of someone who had spent 2 decades in the military. I was trained for long campaigns. I was trained in the art of documentation. I was trained to follow a checklist and trust the process. Her chaotic, emotional attacks were splashing harmlessly against a wall of disciplined procedure, and with every new, unhinged letter she sent, she was unknowingly handing me another weapon to use against her. The trap wasn't just the hay anymore. It was her own pattern of abuse, meticulously documented by her primary target. The turning point came during a phone call with Mark. He had been digging into the HOA's financials, a process Karen had made as difficult as possible. "I finally got a look at the budget, John," he said, his voice tight with a lawyer's controlled anger. "It's worse than I thought. She's been paying her cousin, the HOA attorney, out of the general operating fund. There are 3 payments listed as legal consultation fees, totaling almost $5,000. There was no board vote to approve those expenditures. She just did it. This was the smoking gun. Harassing a non-member was one thing. Misusing the funds paid by her own neighbors was a completely different level of offense. It was a breach of her fiduciary duty, the legal obligation for a board member to act in the best interest of the association. She's using their money to fund her personal vendetta against you," Mark continued. "And I found something else. She's been getting quotes from a real law firm in Atlanta to start the lien and foreclosure process. They quoted her a $10,000 retainer just to get started. She has it on the agenda for the annual meeting next month to approve a special assessment to cover critical legal defense funds. So that was her endgame. She was going to make the entire community pay to sue me into oblivion. It was a bold, desperate move, and it was going to be her undoing." "The annual meeting," I said, a plan beginning to form in my mind. "When is it? And is it open to the public?" "It's the 2nd Tuesday of next month," Mark replied. "And no, it's for members only. They check names at the door." "Why?" "Because that's our stage," I said. "She's going to stand up in front of everyone and paint me as the villain. She's going to ask them for money to attack me. We can't let her control the narrative. We need to present them with the truth, but we need to do it in a way they can't ignore." We spent the next hour brainstorming. I couldn't attend the meeting, but that didn't mean I couldn't be present. The plan we devised was a classic pincer movement, combining a public reveal with a procedural ambush. Phase 1 was my responsibility. I called Deputy Fire Marshal Miller. "Deputy," I said, "I have a bit of an unusual request. The HOA that's been harassing me is having their annual meeting next month. Their president plans to ask the residents for money to sue me over the fire break. I think the homeowners are being dangerously misled about the fire risk. Would you or someone from your office be willing to attend the meeting as a guest speaker to give a brief presentation on fire safety in the Wildland Urban Interface? Miller was silent for a moment, and then I heard him let out a slow, appreciative chuckle. Mr. Garrison, he said, I think that is an absolutely outstanding idea. I'll clear my schedule. I'll even prepare a little PowerPoint presentation. Nothing speaks louder to folks in these neighborhoods than a man in uniform telling them their house could burn down. Phase 2 was Mark's job. As a homeowner and a lawyer, he had standing within the meeting. He would wait for Karen to make her pitch for the special assessment. Then, armed with the financial records and a deep knowledge of their bylaws, he would challenge her on procedural grounds. He would demand to know why the board had approved thousands in legal fees without a vote. He would question the legality of suing a non-member over a non-existent violation. He would call for a full audit of the HOA's finances. Phase 3 was the information campaign. We couldn't risk Karen simply turning off the microphone or ruling Mark out of order. We needed to arm every single homeowner with the facts before the meeting even started. For the next 2 weeks, I became a one-man print shop. I took all the key documents from my binder. Karen's initial threat, my first formal response, the fire marshal's letter, the structural engineer's report on my barn, the Right to Farm Act, the county zoning map, and I compiled them into a neat 10-page packet. I wrote a 1-page cover letter, a simple, direct appeal to my neighbors in Whispering Pines. My name is John Garrison, it began. For the past month, your HOA president has been engaged in a campaign of harassment and intimidation against me, threatening my property and my livelihood. She has done so by misrepresenting the law, ignoring public safety officials, and, I believe, misleading you. At your upcoming annual meeting, she will ask you to fund this personal crusade with your money. Before you vote, I ask you to please review the enclosed documents and decide for yourself what the truth is. I printed 150 copies of the packet. The night before the meeting, under the cover of darkness, Mark and 2 other trusted anti-Karen homeowners executed a stealth operation. They went door to door, slipping a packet under the doormat or into the newspaper slot of every single home in Whispering Pines. By sunrise, every member of the HOA had a dossier of Karen's malfeasance sitting on their doorstep. The stage was set. The audience was primed. Karen was about to walk into a room where she believed she was the star of the show, not realizing she was the sole subject of a meticulously planned public tribunal. The night of the annual meeting was warm and sticky, with the threat of a thunderstorm looming on the horizon. I wasn't there, of course. I was at home, sitting on my porch, watching the heat lightning flash silently in the distance. But I had a live feed. Mark had his phone in his shirt pocket, angled just right, with the call open so I could hear everything. The audio was a little muffled, a mix of shuffling papers, coughs, and the low murmur of 100 conversations in the community clubhouse. I pictured the room. Beige walls, uncomfortable folding chairs, a table at the front with pitchers of lukewarm water. The setting for a revolution. The meeting started with the usual banalities. A reading of the previous year's minutes. A treasurer's report that Mark later told me was deliberately opaque. A report from the landscaping committee about the optimal height for crepe myrtles. I could hear the boredom in the room, the collective sigh of people who just wanted to get this over with and go home. Then Karen took the microphone. Her voice, tinny and distorted over the phone, was filled with a self-important gravity. And now, she announced, we move to the most critical item on our agenda this evening, the long-term security and integrity of our beautiful community. There was a dramatic pause. As many of you know, our neighborhood borders an undeveloped agricultural property that has become a source of significant concern. I could hear a few papers rustle. My packets. People were looking at my packets. This property, she continued, her voice rising with manufactured passion, is maintained in a state of neglect and disarray that not only drastically lowers our property values, but also poses a direct and imminent threat to our safety. I am speaking, of course, of the massive, illegal, and highly flammable pile of hay that its owner, a Mr. Garrison, has stubbornly refused to remove. She was painting a picture of me as some kind of hay-hoarding pyromaniac. For months, your board has attempted to reason with this individual. We have sent notices. We have issued fines. We have consulted with our legal counsel. He has responded with dismissal and contempt. He believes his personal property rights trump our collective safety and the value of our homes. More rustling. I imagine them looking at the copy of my first letter, the polite, professional one, and comparing it to her description. Therefore, she declared, reaching her crescendo, the board is proposing a one-time special assessment of $200 per household. This will create a legal fund of over $30,000, allowing us to retain a top real estate litigation firm and take decisive, forceful action. We will compel him to clean up his property. We will place a lien on his land. We will do whatever it takes to protect Whispering Pines. She finished breathless, clearly expecting a round of applause. Instead, she was met with a heavy, uncertain silence. The rustling of papers grew louder. A few people started whispering to each other. Karen's confidence seemed to waver for a second. "Are there any questions?" she asked, a slight edge to her voice. And that was Mark's cue. I heard his calm, clear voice cut through the silence. "Yes, I have a question, Karen." I could hear the surprise in her tone. "Mark, go ahead." "Karen, you stated that the hay pile is an imminent threat and highly flammable. On what basis do you make that assessment? Did you consult with any fire safety professionals?" "We consulted with our attorney," she snapped back, on the defensive. "He agreed it's a nuisance." "So you didn't speak with the county fire marshal's office?" Mark pressed. "That wasn't necessary," she said dismissively. "It's a matter of common sense." "Well, since you brought it up," Mark's voice was smooth as silk, "I believe we have a guest with us this evening who might be able to shed some professional light on the subject. We're honored to have Deputy Fire Marshal Miller here to give us a brief talk on community fire safety." I could almost hear Karen's jaw drop. Over the phone, I heard a man's authoritative voice. "Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everyone." It was Miller. The trap had been sprung. The air in the room, as described to me later by Mark, went from stale to electric in a single moment. The sight of Deputy Marshal Miller, a man in a crisp uniform with the official county seal on his sleeve, walking to the front of the room was a complete shock to the system. Karen stood frozen by the podium, her face a confused mess of anger and panic. She had lost control of her own meeting. Miller didn't even look at her. He plugged a USB drive into the projector, and the seal of the fire marshal's office appeared on the screen behind him, massive and official. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and resonant, the kind of voice that commands attention without having to raise it. "My name is Deputy Marshal Frank Miller, and I'm the county's specialist for what we call the Wildland Urban Interface, or WUI. That's a fancy term for places exactly like this, where residential developments are built right up against forests, grasslands, or agricultural areas." He clicked to the next slide, which showed an aerial photograph of Whispering Pines bordered by my property. A red line clearly demarcated the boundary. Now, living in a beautiful place like this comes with certain responsibilities, and one of those is fire mitigation. A wildfire doesn't care about property lines or HOA covenants. When we approved the permit for this development, we did so under several strict conditions designed to protect your homes. One of the most important is the creation of a defensible space. He clicked again. A diagram appeared showing a house, a 50-foot buffer zone, and a fuel source, which was a forested area. Your developer was required to create this 50-foot space on your side of the property line, which they have done. But the code also anticipates fuel sources on the other side. In the case of your neighbor, he used a laser pointer to circle my land. He is operating under an agricultural zoning, which is his right. Then came the masterstroke. He clicked to a slide titled Approved Fuel Break Methods. It was a list, and number 3 on that list was dense stacked vegetative buffers, for example, hay bales, straw. "The very thing you're being told is a fire hazard," Miller said, his voice level but firm, "is actually one of the county-approved methods for slowing the spread of a ground fire. A tightly packed hay bale has very little oxygen inside it. It doesn't burst into flames. It smolders. It acts like a big, grassy brick wall, buying precious time for my crews to get here and protect these homes." He then showed a terrifying fire simulation model, a video of how a grass fire would spread without a buffer, racing toward the houses, and then how it would be slowed to a crawl by the wall of hay. The room was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. So to be perfectly clear, Miller concluded, turning to face the audience directly, Mr. Garrison's hay storage is not a violation. It is, from a fire safety perspective, a community asset. In fact, any action taken to force its removal would be a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the county's fire mitigation plan for this entire development. And my office would take a very dim view of that. He turned off the projector and looked right at Karen. "Any questions?" he asked politely. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. Then the whispers started, growing into a low roar of conversation. People were looking at their packets, then at Karen, then back at their packets. The narrative she had so carefully constructed had just been publicly and professionally demolished by an unimpeachable authority. A woman in the front row stood up. "So, you're telling me," she said, her voice trembling with anger, "that we were about to pay thousands of dollars to sue a man for protecting our homes?" Before Karen could stammer out a response, Mark seized the moment. He strode to the microphone. "That is an excellent question, Susan," he said, "and it leads to a few more. Karen, I'd like to ask you about the $5,000 in legal consultation fees paid to your cousin over the last 3 months. Can you show us the board minutes where those expenditures were approved by a vote?" Karen's face went from pale to beet red. That's a board operational matter. According to our bylaws, any non-budgeted expenditure over $500 requires a full board vote and must be recorded in the minutes, Mark retorted, holding up a copy of the HOA's own governing documents. "Those minutes do not exist because that vote never happened. You spent our money without our permission to pursue a personal vendetta, a vendetta that, as we've just learned, would have actually put our homes in greater danger." The dam broke. The room erupted. People were shouting, standing up, waving their information packets in the air. "You lied to us," someone yelled. "You used our money," another screamed. "A vote of no confidence," a man in the back shouted. "I second that." Mark's voice boomed over the chaos. "There is a motion on the floor for a vote of no confidence in Karen as president of this board, on the grounds of gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and misuse of association funds. All in favor?" A forest of hands shot into the air. It looked like nearly everyone in the room. "All opposed?" Mark asked. Karen and her two friends on the board raised their hands timidly. They were islands in a sea of angry homeowners. "The motion carries," Mark declared with finality. "Karen, you are hereby removed as president of the Whispering Pines Estates HOA, effective immediately." Karen just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, her clipboard hanging uselessly at her side. Her reign was over. She had been publicly, thoroughly, and humiliatingly dethroned. She threw the microphone down on the table with a loud clatter, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the room, not to a round of applause, but to a wave of angry, accusatory glares. I clicked off the call on my phone and took a long, slow breath of the night air. The storm on the horizon had finally broken, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall, washing everything clean. The aftermath of the meeting was swift and decisive. The mutiny that had begun with a few whispers and a stealthily distributed information packet culminated in a complete restructuring of power within Whispering Pines. With Karen gone, the remaining board members, including her two cronies who saw the writing on the wall, resigned within the week. A special election was held, and a new board was voted in. Mark was unanimously elected as the new president. His first official act was to draft a letter to me. It arrived not in a creamy, threatening envelope, but in a standard white one, and it was delivered to my door by Mark himself. The letter formally rescinded every single fine Karen had ever issued against me, expunging the debt that had climbed by her ridiculous accounting into the tens of thousands of dollars. It contained a formal, sincere apology on behalf of the HOA for the harassment and undue stress I had been subjected to. It acknowledged my property rights, the jurisdiction of county law, and the vital role my hay pile played in their community's safety. It was a complete and total vindication, a written surrender. But they went further. The new board, under Mark's guidance, invited me to their next meeting, not as a defendant, but as a consultant. They wanted to work with me. Together with input from Deputy Marshal Miller, we developed a cooperative community fire safety plan. The HOA agreed to contribute to the cost of maintaining a wider, mowed fire break on my side of the fence during the driest months, and I agreed to give them advance notice of any controlled burns I planned to conduct. We turned a relationship built on hostility into one based on mutual interest and respect. Neighbors from Whispering Pines who had once glared at me from their SUVs now waved as they drove past. A few even stopped by, bringing pies or just offering a kind word. They had seen the truth and they had chosen community over conflict. But the story doesn't end there. Justice for the community was one thing. Accountability for Karen was another. Armed with the financial records showing her unapproved spending and my binder full of her threatening letters, which established a clear pattern of harassment and abuse of power, Mark and I filed a formal complaint against her with the state's Real Estate Commission, the government body that licenses and regulates community association managers and board members. We laid out the entire saga, complete with exhibits, the fire marshal's testimony, the financial malfeasance, the blatant disregard for state laws governing HOAs. We weren't seeking monetary damages for myself. We were seeking to have her held accountable in a way that would prevent her from ever holding a position of power over anyone ever again. The state investigation took several months. During that time, Karen and her husband put their house up for sale. The public humiliation was apparently too much to bear. They sold their beige palace at a loss and moved away, disappearing from the community she had tried so desperately to control. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after that fateful HOA meeting, another official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. This one was from the state. The commission's findings were enclosed. They had found Karen guilty on multiple counts: breach of fiduciary duty for the misuse of funds, failure to maintain proper records, and actions detrimental to the interest of the public, citing her attempts to have a legally mandated fire break removed. The consequences were severe. She was permanently barred from ever serving on an HOA board in the state again. She was also personally fined $25,000, a sum far greater than the special assessment she had tried to levy against her neighbors to fund her war against me. The irony was exquisite. Her own lust for power and control had resulted in her public disgrace, financial penalty, and permanent banishment from the world she so desperately wanted to dominate. She had tried to bury me in paper, and in the end, she was the one buried. Today, life on my 100 acres has returned to its peaceful rhythm. The horses graze contentedly in the pasture. The old barn stands proud and steadfast, its faded paint a badge of honor. And along the fence line, a neat, solid wall of hay bales sits under the Georgia sun. They are a symbol, a quiet monument to a battle fought and won, not with anger, but with patience. Not with shouting, but with documentation. Not with aggression, but with the simple, unyielding power of the truth. Every now and then, I look over at that wall of hay, and I think of Karen. I hope she's somewhere, looking at a manicured lawn, still seething about the injustice of a world that refused to bend to her will. And I smile, because my grandfather's legacy is safe, my horses are fed, and the quiet dignity of this land endures. Justice, like the land itself, is a patient and powerful force.